Let me read to you a passage from the 15th chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 9 to 17. It's the Gospel for the 6th Sunday in Eastertide, Year B. St. John writes, Jesus said to his disciples, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything I learnt from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. This is my command: love one another." That's from John chapter 15, verses 9 to 17. What does it suggest to us? Well, a very important issue is the influence of religion on society. One of the notable characteristics of indigenous religion is that it tends to pervade the whole life of the society. For this reason, it can be difficult to define it in individual cases, precisely because it is coterminous with the culture of the people. But this does not mean that the indigenous society itself is entirely shaped by its religion, for it can be the case that its religion is rather largely shaped by the society. For instance, its notions of the powers above and the myths associated with them could reflect the institutions of the society. Well, be that as it may, my point in introducing this example is that a great challenge for religion is that it be brought to bear on the concrete life of society. The danger is that the two proceed along parallel lines, with religion being confined to worship and private prayer, and society being conducted according to independent ethical criteria, which may not actually be very ethical. In the case of a religion which is not especially ethical, this would not matter much, because in that case society would not benefit ethically by the influence of such a religion. But the Christian religion is a profoundly ethical religion, and it is meant by its divine founder to influence all of human life, including the life of society. Its demands embrace not only worship and private piety, but also man precisely in his community life and culture. But all too often, Christian societies have many profoundly unchristian mores and laws. It takes for granted that each human person is an absolute value, and yet it often has laws that permit rampant abortion. Revealed religion is not a religion that simply accepts, however genuinely and profoundly, the great realities of the Holy Trinity, the Incarnation and the Atonement, as the defining element of one's personal and private life. Rather, it insists that this revelation by God of his will be the inspiration for the Christian also in his involvement in society. The individual is called to strive to make God's will and plan accepted by society as the basis and soul of its life. There are those who dispute the proposition that the ethics of a secular society ought to be inspired by divine revelation. They deny that the human community has the God of revelation, and specifically the law of Jesus Christ, as its guide. Of course, to an extent, and in one sense, this is true, For instance, a democratic society cannot impose on its citizens belief in the Holy Trinity, the Incarnation, and the atonement for sin by Christ. But revealed religion does bring to light in a supremely sure way the demands of reason and morality, and it is these demands as enlightened by Christ which ought to be the guide of human society, as also the individual. For instance, at the heart of Christ's teaching is the value of the human person. In our gospel passage that I read earlier, our Lord gives his command to his disciples. It is that they must love one another. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, our Lord describes the Last Judgment, and it will hinge on how we treat our neighbour, because Christ will take as having been done to him whatever good and whatever unjust evil we do to our neighbour, especially to those most in need. It is clear, or should be clear, to all that the practice of religion involves, of course, love for God. What we must also be clear about is that love for neighbour is inseparable from love for God. Therefore, what happens in the human community is of direct relevance to the living of revealed religion. If we wish to be a follower and a friend of Christ, we must strive to make society filled with the Spirit of Christ and structured in its institutions and laws according to his will. Each person, especially the most forgotten and insignificant, must be the principle, the subject, and the end of all social institutions. Certain societies and groupings, most especially the family, are absolutely necessary for the human person. If the human person is to be loved and respected, so must be the family. Society requires respect for justice, the supremacy of the spiritual, meaning the supremacy of God, and a turning away from sin and wrongdoing. Charity, love for neighbour, which is the specific command of our Lord in the Gospel I read earlier, is the greatest social commandment. It's the greatest commandment for society. The Catholic Church has a large and striking body of official social teaching, developed on the basis of revelation and formally applying it at the level of her highest authority to the structure and life of society. All the popes, the modern popes, since Pope Leo XIII in the last quarter of the 19th century, have taught the Church and the world how society ought to be conducted in the light of the teaching of Christ. The Christian ought, as part of his Christian life, bring that teaching to bear on his life in society. Society is called to be pleasing to God, just as each individual person is. As each person will be judged, so will societies. Let us therefore strive at the personal and individual level, but also at the social and cultural level, to live according to the mind and will of Christ.